Good evening, councillors. Welcome to the first meeting live in our new setup, and officers, of course. Fire alarms, we're not expecting any, but if there is, that means there is a fire, and we go out the main entrance and assemble there. Phones, we please put them on silence or switch them off. Obviously we're being webcast, so to make you all aware, that's why I've had my hair done today. And the only other thing that comes up, we got, as you most probably all know, we've got problems with toilets. I suggest that we carry on for an hour, and if people need to go, we all go together and close the meeting and start again. If that is suitable to you, councillors, but if people obviously need a comfort break before that, they need to let us know, but we will be stopping the meeting because the toilets are over in the other building. Okay, right, item 1, apologies for absence. Have we any? Thank you, I've got that one. Any more? Declarations of interest.
Yes, Chair. Agenda item 5, the annual review of the housing allocations policy. Just a personal interest in that. I work for Sovereign Housing Association, so do use the allocations policy in my daily work, but I don't think it stops me discussing the items on this agenda. So thanks.
We have no urgent matters. Item 4, minutes of the meeting held on the 20th of July. Are we happy with those? Please show. Yep. I'll sign those. Annual review of the housing. I've lost it already. Annual review of the housing allocations policy. I don't know who's opening. Is it Councillor Robinson? Over to you.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, members, for your time this evening. The housing allocations policy is key to making sure that we help residents at all stages in life access the homes that they need. And the housing allocations policy sets out the policy basis for allocating what is oftentimes, unfortunately, a scarce level of resource. Over the past few years, we've made great progress in delivering more affordable homes than the target. The target for those members new to the committee is 300 a year. And in the year 2018-19, the delivery was 412. In 2019-20, it's 494. And then last year, the year which we're discussing this evening, it was 380. Which slipped back slightly due to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, but it's good to see that the delivery remains strong. In particular, I would welcome the fact that last year there were a higher number of social rent completions as well, which is really helpful for delivering on our policies. In terms of the total number of lettings, there were 795 homes for rent advertised on the choice-based lettings system last year, which is about in keeping with where we have been year on year. It's slightly lesser than the previous year due to less people moving around, again due to the impact of COVID. Less people obviously were able to move property last year. I'm encouraged in the report by the fact that the number of people using bed and breakfast accommodation continues to reduce as well, alongside the work that we've been doing with rough sleepers. I'm going to hand over to, for those new members, we've got Kate Randall, who, without seeing her thing, I think is Head of Housing, the latest title, and Sue Nosey, who is Housing Needs and Homelessness Manager for the Council. I'm going to hand over to Kate and Sue, who've got a presentation, and they'll run through some of the detail of the housing allocations policy, and very happy to take any questions that members have got at the end of the presentation. Thank you. Kate.
Thank you. Good evening, members. Some new faces for us as officers, which is why we prepared the short presentation just to sort of walk through the main points that are in the report, because there's a lot of technical information in there, and forgive us if we do slip into jargon and assume that there is sort of prior knowledge of some of the things we're talking about, because it is quite a detailed policy area, but housing and who's going to get housed are obviously things that are very important to our residents, and will often come through to you as ward members. In terms of what we're going to cover in the introduction to the paper, just a very, very brief overview of what the allocations policy is, how it works, and what the headlines are from the 2021 review. We do review the policy annually, and we bring the outcomes of that review to Scrutiny every year for members to consider, and also looking at what actions moving forward as a result of the review. So in terms of what the allocations policy is, in a nutshell, it's the set of rules about who gets what for social housing for rent, who can be offered what types of property and how they might be offered them. It's predominantly set down, the framework for allocations policies are set down in statutes, but there are areas for local discretion to set that policy. And our policy, the current policy that we have and reviewed, is adopted by Cabinet and full council. And as I say, we review and publish the results of that review annually. So the review that you're receiving tonight has already been published on the council's website. In terms of some of the key things to remember about the allocation policy, it's not an open list. So we have to check when people want to apply for housing, their immigration status, their local connection to Basingstoke and Deane. For most cases, there are some exceptions in relation to cases around domestic abuse and army cases. And we also check that there is a housing need, and I put that in inverted commas because there is that could be quite a relative concept, but there is a very sort of fixed definition within the policy. And people also have to have, that there are caps on the income and savings that people can have in order to join our housing register. So we also use in the policy criteria to match applicants to properties by size and type, and whether they're in rural areas or whether they're adapted. So for example, you wouldn't have a single person applying for and being successful for a 4-bedroom house, because the eligibility criteria sets out that there are certain properties that meet their needs. And it's also important to remember that we don't own any housing stock of our own. Not only does this mean that the allocations policy governs nominations, it also means that we can't guarantee that that nomination will result in a successful allocation. And I think we impress these points because these are the issues that tend to crop up very much on a ward member basis. And also, housing, as has been mentioned, is a scarce resource. So what the policy is trying to do is make the best out of a range of strategic objectives. And unfortunately, it's the case that with every winner for social housing and within the policy for priority, there's going to be a loser. And that's the very difficult balance that we often have to make. If this person or this cohort of person is given priority, what's the impact on other people on the housing register? I'm going to pass over to Sue just to briefly describe how the policy works.
The button. Lovely, thank you. So essentially, once somebody meets the qualifying criteria in terms of local connection, capital and savings, we then have a simplified 3-band system. So band 1 is reserved for real critical urgent rehousing cases. We have about 3% of the housing register that are in band 1. It also picks up on things like under occupation of properties, so to try and free up some of the larger units. And it also allows us to consider housing association tenants who have been given management moves and giving them additional priority. It's a time-limited band, so applicants are able to stay in that band for 3 months, and that property allows them to move very quickly through the housing register because of the nature of their urgent situation. Pretty much everybody else, about, I want to say 95% of the register, once they've got an identified housing need, They're then placed into band 2, and they're in that band in date order. We then have a band 3, which is a demoted band, and that might be for people who are in a supported housing placement and they're not yet ready to move on. But it also picks up on people who might have housing related debt, for example, and until such time as that's been resolved or there's a repayment plan in place, people would stay in the demoted band. As I say, it now works that once you're in the band, you're in within date order. So that addresses issues around queue jumping. You can now sort of explain to people how long they're likely to wait before they're likely to bid successfully. The system we use is a choice-based letting scheme. So each week we have a bidding cycle whereby all properties are advertised on the website. Applicants log on within the bidding cycle. They may place one bid on a property that they're eligible to bid on. And at the end of the bidding cycle, we then devise a shortlist which is provided to the Housing Association, and we do that shortlist in accordance with our own allocation policy. As Kate mentioned, once we hand that list over to the Housing Association, it's their own lettings policy that applies. So that's why sometimes somebody might make a bid, will place the nomination, but they don't meet the criteria for the Housing Association. That's quite a simple how the scheme works.
Thank you, Sue. That's as simple as we can get it. Anyway, just in terms of the review, the annual review, picking out the main headlines, but also that there may have been things within the review or the report that you want to pick up and question us on as well. But in terms of last year, there were, as Councillor Robertson said, 795 vacancies. Those are, but at the end of the year, there are around 5,000 applicants on the housing register. We have now been able to start doing the regular and thorough review of cases, so the number has fallen since then, and it is currently at
Just shy of 3,900.
COVID did have an impact on delivery, but it was marginal. All lettings came to a pause at one point, and considering how significant that impact was across the sector, we still achieved 795 adverts on the system, which is good. I think that's was offset by the fact that prior to COVID, we obviously had high levels of delivery, which exceeded our annual affordable delivery targets, which do sort of bear witness to the importance of affordable housing delivery and make sure that we get our 40% with any new delivery, and that there's an ongoing programme for that. Paragraphs 3.2.2 of your report, we actually have evidence that the waiting times, again, compared to last year, we found this last year as well, for most property types are falling, and that's not just against a year-on-year comparison, that's also against our other authorities in Hampshire. So in terms of some of the waits that some people have to face across the county, it's not as bad in Basingstoke and Deane as in some areas. The clear exception to this rule, and this is something that has been a feature of our housing register for as long as I've been at the council, is the unmet levels of demand for single people. And I think in the report we mentioned that, you know, the impact of that in the time of COVID, all of the bed and breakfast placements that we were making were for single people, and all of the issues, most pressing issues at the moment we're facing are for single people. Some other headlines, a nice catchy 8 out of 10. Around 8 out of 10 vacancies were through VID and Sovereign, and I highlight that because I think that's important in terms of when we're talking about who our key partners are and who needs to be around the table. We have over 20, 24, 25 housing associations operating in the borough, but actually some of them are quite small bit players compared to what we see here. And 8 out of 10 vacancies were let at social rent. So in terms of affordability, that's quite key as well. And for families, which is something that the committee has focused its attention on in previous years, more houses than flats became available to rent across the piece, which is quite important. So in terms of whether or not we would be recommending any changes to the policy, No, we're not recommending any changes, given that we've got a very sort of simple structure for prioritising applicants. However, we are suggesting that, given that there's a relative oversupply of 2-bedroom flats compared to 1-beds and compared to other properties, that's not to say that, you know, that still isn't enough of all types of accommodation, but maybe we could look at discussing with our housing associations advertising some of those vacancies for single people, single households. And as Sue's mentioned, we don't have a call on that because it's down to housing associations whether or not they would tolerate that level of under-occupation, because there are implications in terms of affordability. The other big ticket item in terms of the allocation scheme is that we need to bring forward proposals, which will be through a portfolio holder report, to ensure that we've got enough priority within the system to deal with the regeneration schemes that are now gathering momentum, particularly Winklebury, which is in a place where a planning application might soon be made. So we need to make sure that we have the provision within our policy to protect and prioritise tenants who need to be decanted under those procedures. So those are the main things that we're recommending for change and review over the next year. That's all we had to say. Over to you.
Well, any questions? Sorry, I will say your name. Mama Maloney, Councillor.
Okay, sure.
Oh.
Thank you, Chair. Given the current policy, and we have an emergency need of these Afghan refugees, so what measures are being taking place, or are we providing any extra measures, or the current policy is going to work for them too?
The Afghan refugees piece that we're pursuing at the moment with central government is pursued slightly differently. They don't fall into the same category as general needs. They're catered for under a different scheme. We've got 4 offers of accommodation outstanding at the moment. Kate's nodding. So just seeing whether any more had come in. A couple of those are with the housing associations. I know one's with a private landlord as well, which is positive. What we're waiting for at the moment is for the people that have been identified by the Home Office, essentially as being eligible for those properties. That's working through the system, and then they'll be put into placement. But it's separate to the housing allocations policy. They're catered for a specific, through a different set of policies.
Chair, if I may, so is it going to impact our numbers then? Because we don't have any housing supplies, and we have the target, and central government is influencing some of these target taken by, rightfully for the Afghani refugees. We always, owe them, so we need to do that. But is it going to impact our policy and our targets? And if it is, how are we going to mitigate them?
You're right in that it has an impact. Clearly there is a set number of houses available, and there is a number of people on the list. As Sue mentioned, 3,900 who are on the list. And if you put a person in a house, that house cannot be used for somebody else. That's true. I think we would consider that the impact is minimal in terms of the 4 units which have been made available. Those are the people who've been assigned to Basingstoke through the central government scheme. So that administration of the government scheme has yielded 4 people to Basingstoke. We've had local offers. Certainly in the case of one of those units, so 25% of that, I guess you could say, have been offered by a private landlord who may not have offered that unit of accommodation to the social register. They've chosen to do that out of the goodness of their own heart, I guess, so that wouldn't have an impact, whereas the remaining 3 with housing associations would, but I think we'd consider that's quite minimal in the context of the churn, around 795. I can't do a percentage on 3 out of 795 right now, but it's quite small. And I think the important thing is to make sure that we keep delivering over and above our target of 300 units a year. That's the key.
Councillor Aldridge.
Thank you, Tony. Right, I've got a few questions, but I'll kick off with a couple if that's okay. The first one, how many of the new builds that were built, the 383, I think it was, new builds were at social rent as opposed to affordable rent?
79 units, 28%. So 380 units total completions. Social completions were 79. Total affordable completions were 130 and intermediate completions were 171. So as a percentage, 20.8 social, 34.2 affordable, 45 intermediate.
And supplementary to that is, how many of them were 2-bed flats? Because, you know, it mentions throughout the report about, you know, there being a plentiful amount of 2-bed flats, but not enough 1-bed flats. So I'm just interested in the proportion between the split between those two.
We've got a very detailed spreadsheet, which I know. The question is again, how many were two-bedroom flats?
Well, what I'm getting at is there seems to be, it mentions throughout the report, there's a wealth of supply of 2-bed flats to the point where we're looking at putting single people in them. And I'm interested to know how many of the new builds were new 2-bed flats as opposed to 1-bed flats, given that the overriding need for 1-bed, and also, you know, the fact that people want coming around to the idea that they're wanting housing and prepared to wait for houses rather than flats. You know, how many of them are houses as opposed to flats? Because I suppose what I'm getting at, what pressure is being put on the registered providers to provide the housing type that we need, and not just loads of 2-bed flats, because they're what's, you know, sort of they can churn out really.
While Kate's finding the exact figures, the chart that I've got in front of me, which you can probably see there, but people can't see on the webcast, I appreciate, is actually last year there were more 1-bedroom flats. There were more 1-bedroom properties. It doesn't actually say whether they were a flat or not, but 1-bedroom properties delivered than 2-bedroom properties, as it was the case last year, but only very marginally in 1920. Certainly in the time that I've been involved, we've been putting a lot of pressure on the registered social landlords to bring forward 1-bedroom properties, because that has been the key need on the social housing list. Certainly, well, as Kate said, certainly for the time that she's been involved, which is some time, without wanting to.
If I comment on that one, the reason I'm asking the question is it's the Leyland healthcare site down in Northern Ward. The proposal is for an awful lot of 2-bed flats there, and very. Yeah, from I haven't got the exact figures in my head, but relatively few sort of 1-bedders, and a couple. There's about 4 maisonettes, but most of them are 2-bed flats. And I'm just thinking, well, you know, what pressure is being put on? Well, in this case, Vivid. Yeah.
We can certainly take that away and look to speak to Vivid on that particular case, because you're right, you know, we've got that need and we need to make sure that's reflected through what's being built, so we can certainly take that away. I don't know if Kate's got anything to add.
We've been drilling down into a lot of data, which is why we're sort of ferreting around a detailed spreadsheet, but we actually produced more houses than flats last year. I think the difficulty is when you produce a flatted scheme, it obviously is very prominent, so that it's quite easy to make an assumption that that's the only thing that's being delivered, whereas actually on a sort of 106 site, it may well be the case that that new provision is pepper potted around. So we do have quite a significant influence in terms of our enabling role and making sure that proposals that come through the process are sustainable and give a broad mix of accommodation. And it's I think it would be quite interesting when we're able to publish the information that we've only just been able to compile around actually what properties have come off the development process as a result of that enabling function, because there are fewer flats than you would be led to believe compared to within the overall supply of flats and houses. And a large proportion of the 2-bedroom of the flats produced are actually 1-bedroom, which meets a need.
Possible once, no rush on this, but once you've got that information, just to circulate it to us, just so we can have a look at that. Thanks.
Councillor Miller.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Well, first of all, may I thank Kate and Sue for their, I thought, excellent presentation. The whole paper, the whole document, for me as a relative newcomer, this is really filling my education. It really is, along with the presentations we've had recently from Viv and Sovereign. The paper is very comprehensive in terms of being pan the borough. I've always thought there was an object of putting people in their own community. You don't mention any wards or anything at all in the paper. Is there an opportunity to find out the information relevant to each ward? There are certain wards that need accommodation as a greater priority than others where there's no particular problem. So that's my first. Well, can I just ask you to answer that one to start with? Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, great.
Yes, we can. I think the bit that Kate and Sue did mention in the presentation was around rural need in particular. Rural and urban need, and we do look to group it that way through the policy. So people may have a particular affiliation to a parish, say, and that does get taken into account when looking at the lists. However, I've struggled with this before, I'll be really honest, and I think it's one of the areas of our allocations policy which I think ideally we would do something else with. The problem is I have yet to find something else that works and is better. Because, for example, I know a case in Charter Alley, for example, where they are resident in Wootton St Lawrence parish. However, if a property became available in the Monk Sherborne side of Charter Alley, and let's not make any bones about it, this is two houses next door to each other, they wouldn't necessarily qualify because the parish connection wouldn't suit. You know, likewise, you could have the same issue in Pamber as opposed to Tadley, you know, where actually the line is one side of Burney Bit or the other, you know, and that's a real challenge. And so we are looking at how we can look to that about a parish or maybe an adjacent parish in cases like that. But there are issues there. You're right, there are issues there. But certainly on a ward by ward breakdown, we can provide some more information. That's not a problem at all.
Sorry, just as a supplementary to that, if I may, Chair. There's no homelessness, we keep getting told, in the borough. Well, we declare there's no homelessness, I believe. No? We're back? Okay. I understand there's no homelessness in my ward anyway, but there's a lot of HMO, a lot of multiple occupancy of houses, young people, and I presume these are the people that are looking for the 1-2 bedroom flats. Is that the way that you move people on?
So on the homelessness point, certainly since I've been involved, which is 2.5 years, give or take, nobody has made a statement that there is no homelessness in Basingstoke-on-Deane. The statement that has been made is there were, at the time of the count, there were no rough sleepers in Basingstoke-on-Deane, and this is a nuance in language, because there is a difference between somebody rough sleeping on the street, who I think we would all agree are those in the most dire need. However, that does not take away from the fact that there are others who may be sofa surfing, maybe in an overcrowded HMO, maybe in another need, living with parents, staying with friends, all of those different other needs. So yes, and I think this is where the challenge is around. There are 3,900 people on the social housing register, and that ranges from people who might be staying with friends, might be sofa surfing, to people who, you know, younger people who are living with parents who are in secure accommodation, if you like, but they do have a need to move out at an appropriate point, and I think there's just a difference there. But yes, the people in the wider list could be any number of those things: sofa surfing, living with parents, overcrowded, etc. As long as they've got a housing need, which is why Kate put it in inverted commas on the slide, I think, because it depends on how you assess that, which perhaps Kate could give some more detail on briefly.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole list of, we in technical terms, they're called reasonable preference categories, and that's set out in legislation, and it will include things that you'd expect to see, like overcrowding, under occupation. Sue's probably best to riddle down the list because I know she deals with this every day. So
Yeah, if I can remember. Yeah. So you have somebody who's overcrowded, somebody whose health, be that physical or mental well-being, that's exacerbated because of their housing conditions. You're talking about people that are sharing facilities. We have a local definition which says that if you're sharing with family but you're a household in your own right, you're also able to join the register. People's certain homelessness responsibilities we have are also included in that list. So in order to join the register, you need to meet one of the categories.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just to follow on from what Derek said, I think you first came here in 2017, and every year the councillors have thanked you, for very good reports, and also those of us that have been on the end of some of the housing issues. Your department is always incredibly supportive, so thank you for that. There's just a couple of points in the report, because in some ways we've gone away from policy onto what's actually in the report as input to other strategies. I was very interested to see that 52% of uptake in the rural communities, that's all that there was from people that qualified as a local need. So it's virtually half of those going into the rural properties are from the towns. That's come as a quite surprise, because just in normal debate it's often said there's nowhere near enough housing, etc., for local people or for downsizing. But these results would seem to indicate a conflict there. So that was just interesting in terms of inputting to our own housing strategies. And I was also slightly intrigued, the 50% of the people in the towns, how do you, as it were, persuade them to move to join us out in the sticks?
And they're actively choosing to bid on those. So, if anybody with a local connection bids on a property, they are prioritised. But if people are choosing not to, there are lots of people in the sort of urban part that would love to come to the rural areas.
For me, that's probably one of the really good things about the policy, is that actually it is choice-based lettings. And, it's not the council saying to somebody, this is the house that we think is appropriate for you. It's people looking at the properties that are available on the list, and granted, there are challenges around making sure there are enough properties available and there are enough of a particular type. But fundamentally, the person who is making a bid on that list is bidding for that property. And so they may choose that actually they want to stay in the town, they want to be in the countryside. Maybe there's a reason for that in terms of family support networks, etc. But it is choice based, so people do make an active choice to make a bid on that property, and hopefully they're successful.
Councillor Jeans.
Just drawing your attention to 3.2.3, issues single people. I note progressing proposals for a new supported housing scheme for single people at Culver Road. Is that in relation to the proposals for 180, or is it an additional scheme?
That is 180 Culver Road.
So are we expecting that facility could be potentially used just for housing single people who are on the housing list, in addition to those coming from May Place, or? Are you?
It's not one and the same, if that makes sense, because it's 180 Culver Road is temporary accommodation, in the sense that somebody would go there who is in the most dire housing need to have that wraparound support network there in that facility while they placed a bid on another property. So it's helping them in that transition. So in that sense, it doesn't take people off the register long term. It provides a transition for those people who don't have somewhere to live in the short term. They would stay there while they explore and are placed in another property, which would then be long term, and they have that wraparound support while they're at Culver Road.
And so just as a side to that, I know that from the proposals for Culver Road, the anticipated length of stay was around 6 to 9 months. If we're waiting for people to be rehoused, looking at the average waiting time in years for a 1-bedroom flat, that would be around 3 years and not the expected 6 to 9 months. Am I correct?
For band 2, yes. However, for a number of the people in that need that would be occupying a hostel of that nature, such as May Place or Culver Road, a number of those would often be band 1 due to their specific circumstances, in which case the waiting time would be vastly reduced. But Kate or Sue might want to pick up on that.
And the vast majority of occupants would move on to stage 2 accommodation, which would be other supported housing schemes around the borough. So it's very few actually go from May Place into independent accommodation. That it's very sort of staged. So in all likelihood, I would expect most of the move on from May Place from a new Culver Road facility to still be into other supported and shared accommodation, managed HMOs within the town.
Sorry. I'm going to call Councillor Bowles, because she hasn't spoken before, so I'd like everybody to have a go, and then I'll come back round. I've got other names.
Both. Hello. It's probably a silly question, but in regard to people from rural communities not making a bid, how sure are we that they have stable internet connection and can actually be in a position to make a bid?
Sorry. So for people that don't have access, they're able to receive a newsletter. But in terms of the application, it's an online application. They provide their email address. They're given details of choice-based lettings and the cycle. But if there are any problems, we send out newsletters to people that can't access.
Councillor Compton, Bennett.
I just wanted to ask about adapted housing. So, what is the average wait time for an adapted house, and how many new homes that we've built are adapted? And when a house or a flat comes available that is able to be adapted, is that sort of noted and, if necessary, adapted ready for somebody that urgently needs it?
That's a really interesting question. I think Kate and Sue will come back on the detail, but in terms of how many adapted, I think just having a look through the document, and we might have to come back on that. In terms of when an adaptive flat becomes available, yes, absolutely, that is noted, and then we try and allocate that property to somebody who needs a similar adaptation. The reason I'm being slightly careful is because the challenge always is matching people with the adaptations, and no two people are ever the same, and that's where our disabled facility grants, the DFGs, come into play in adapting new properties to make sure that we are providing. Often you'll find people do have slightly different needs, and making sure that we provide for that is really important. But yes, absolutely, and I can say with relative confidence that we do not allocate buildings or homes that are already adapted to people who do not need, an adaptation. They might not need all of them because their needs might be slightly different, but we wouldn't allocate a property to somebody who didn't need any of the adaptations into an adapted property, because not only would that not make sense for individuals, that wouldn't make sense in terms of providing, because you'd be wasting those adaptations only to spend money on DFGs in another property. So yeah, Kate.
The only caveat I would add to that is that DFG adapted properties, disabled facilities grants, are extremely bespoke to the needs of the occupant. So sometimes getting a perfect match is extremely difficult, and it's a sort of judgment call really on, do you keep trying to plug the adapted nature of the property, or do you just actually go with it being a property that's for any household? And it's a judgment call that's made for every particular property that becomes available. But there are policies in the local plan for requiring certain levels, certain percentages of properties to be to lifetime home standard. Don't have the figure off the top of my head, but there are those policies. And yes, properties have to be able to be adapted. So not all of them are, but they can be advertised potentially for use by a disabled person if an adaptation is appropriate. It's an absolute minefield of what ifs and wherefores and what have you. But it's obviously right that that we prioritise properties for people with disabilities, and it's also right that we try to minimise undue additional expenditure on DFGs because money's already been spent using it.
In terms of the local plan, I don't have it to hand, but there's wheelchair adaptable properties, which is M4 brackets 2, which is set out of how many we have to deliver as a percentage of the affordable. Although one of the conversations we're having through the local plan update is whether we subsume that into the private as well. I think it's a really interesting point. We shouldn't just be delivering wheelchair accessible or adaptable properties in the affordable. It should be in the private as well. So that's M42, and then there's M43, which is wheelchair adapted already. So that's the difference between a building which at the lower level would have, wider door frames so you can get a wheelchair through, etc., through to a building which has stronger joists in so you could put a hoist in or a standard stair lift, for example. It's just the differences and the nuances of the properties.
Just to come back on the first question, what's the average waiting time for an adapted?
It depends on what you're looking for.
Is it much longer than for a for somebody that doesn't have those additional needs?
That can depend.
Sorry.
It really does depend on the type and size of property that somebody's looking for, and sometimes it can be a much shorter wait depending on what somebody's needs are. We've got we had about 230 of the properties that were advertised last year were suitable for people who required ground floor accommodation, or it had some adaptations. Now, as Kate pointed out, what might be an adapted property or might have some adaptations may not necessarily match the families that are waiting for it, and that's why they don't all go to people who have that particular adaptation. But every property, if it's got an adaptation in, we would give priority to somebody on the register that requires it.
Well, I have 3 more speakers, plus myself will be 4. Just to let you know, I haven't forgotten you. Councillor Mullally.
Thank you, Chair. With your permission, Chair, I would like to urge to consider increasing the home loan scheme, which is under 250k for the properties. How many properties right now we get in the market for under 250k? That is what I would like to urge you to consider that one for the upgrading scheme, because from last year to now, the house prices has gone up by at least, if not 10%, at least 5 to 10%. So if you could link that one to the house price inflation, that would be nice. Thank you.
It's a very fair point. Thank you. We'll take that on. We'll take that away. I know the own home loan scheme will have been in place for, I'm thinking, 2 years towards the back end of this year. So we are looking at how that scheme's worked and part of it, and that could definitely form part of it. We're also looking at introducing. So right now, I think this is an interesting point for this evening. Actually, right now we have one list, which is a general needs affordable list, and one of the things that we're looking at in terms of policy is a separate low cost home ownership list, because what's appropriate for people who are in a dire housing need, should we say, that should be tailored through the affordable homes that are delivered to make sure they are delivered as social rent for the people who need them. And actually, we should potentially have a separate list for those people who aren't in dire need but are still struggling to afford a home on the open market, and we can look at ways to help them through the Own Home Loan, through the government's new First Homes scheme, which looks to deliver market properties at 80% of market value. So we're looking at a low-cost home ownership list for that, and I think splitting the two out will be really important, because that way we can target the affordable and the social rent to the people who need it, and the affordable products to the people who need low-cost home ownership, and we can wrap that into that, certainly.
Councillor Mellor?
Thank you, Chair. I read in another paper that we've been very successful in COVID, etc., in recovering rents, and we don't have a big bad debt situation on social housing. Is that correct?
Don't know where you read that. The only thing that I would say is you might have read that in context of commercial property. Given Basingstoke's context as a landlord, you might have read that in, I know you sit on audit as well, so you might have read that in terms of commercial property rents and not had a significant rent loss through that. Certainly from our point of view, because we don't own any housing stock as a local authority, it's all LSVT, so it's all under housing associations. I don't think there's not a risk of that, so to speak, to the council, and we are generally very successful through particularly our main two partners, Sovereign and Vivid, in making sure that their rents are capped at LHA, thank you, local housing allowance levels, rather than having to stomach the difference, as it were. So I don't think so is the answer.
Okay, sorry, Chair, I appreciate this is all about housing allocation, but that did have some impact in my mind.
Sorry, this is what the committee is all about. We need to find out.
Right.
If we don't ask the questions, we won't get the
Okay.
answers.
Right, thank you.
Councillor Waldry.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a couple more questions, but before I do that, just a comment on the rural bidding thing and the fact that rural people aren't bidding. It'd be interesting to see the split between over 55s people and general needs, because I think that might skew with the figures a little bit. So if you want to investigate that, because there's an awful lot of over 55 properties in the rural areas which may be hard to let. So just for your own information, you might want to do that. A couple of questions. Page 15, the breakdown between extra, you lump them together basically, over 55s and extra care properties, and I would suspect that the waiting list for extra care is very different to that of over 55s, and I would be interested in a breakdown in that, and in terms of working out what we need in terms of accommodation for old people in the borough. So I don't know if you can comment on that at all. I don't expect you to necessarily do it here and now, but I'd be interested to see that breakdown. And the other one, page 30, 2.7. When you
have you got the report number?
Yeah, 2.7. It's on page 30. It's, oh God, I don't know. I think it might be part of the appendix actually. So,
2.7.
Yeah, page 30 of the overall report. Oh, yeah, it is 2.7. Under local connection. Talk about 25 applicants didn't require the local connection and made reference to people in the armed forces. Just prompted a thought about people who are suffering from domestic violence, especially given the rise of that during COVID. Just wondered, how, did we house any people with domestic violence, through the waiting list, and if not, what provision has been made for those people, given that they may well not have a local connection if they're fleeing the area where they're from. So basically, just those two questions, please.
So sorry, if somebody is fleeing domestic abuse, they don't have to meet the qualification for time living in the borough. But well, I don't necessarily see how we'd be able to pick up people that have been housed. I'll have a look and see what we can pull up retrospectively as to whether or not domestic abuse was no local connection. I'll have to come back to you on that.
They don't need to, they can join the list now.
Yeah.
They can join the list, yeah.
Councillor Silbury.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think on this issue of the rural connection and my experience is, kept saying there's not been a lot of flats, but the problem is in some of the rural areas there are too many flats because we had just had development in Over and 120 houses, 40% affordable. We've got 28 flats within that in three blocks. And of the 28, only 4 went to local families or households. I think the part of the problem is when we get a new Section 106 site, a large site comes forward like this, it goes to Kate's team and they say, well, there's these number of people in, say, Overton or Whitchurch, and and it works quite well for the people who are eligible for 3 or 4 bedroomed house because that's all you're going to get. You're not going to get the option of a flat, but the developers will invariably build flats because they're much cheaper. But then people don't want them because the flats that come forward, if you look at least the old council flats, generally have an outdoor space where you could dry your washing and that sort of thing. The new ones, like on this ghastly Overton Hill development, they're just blocks of flats. There's no outdoor space. So no one wants to move in there because, if you're on a low income, the last thing you want is to have to buy a tumble dryer, to do your washing all year round. And that sort of gets forgotten there. They're providing the cheapest option, which is flats, rather than 2-bedroom. There are some 2-bedroom houses, but they're always in short supply. So then the next site will come along, and of course the same people are being used to justify building more 2-bedroom properties, which always end up as flats. So we just end up with loads and loads of flats in the rural areas that no one wants. They then go to people from outside the village who are putting there on low incomes, and they can't afford to live there because they got to travel to work every day, and it costs the best part of £6 to get to Basingstoke on the bus. So you end up with this sort of vicious circle, and then they want to move out again all the time because they accept it. They will bid for it because they've got the choice to bid, but when they get there, they realise actually living in the countryside is not all it seems to be. Sorry if you've got a car, but for people on real low incomes, they are going to struggle with these sort of things. So we just end up getting more and more flats that no one wants living in the rural areas, and that would account for a lot of the fact that the people are not bidding for them because there are people on the list, and I've had this discussion with Kate and her team many times. But then people may say, well, why do they go to all these people from outside their village or whatever? But it's because no one who are on the list, and there are people on there, because they're used to justify building the 2-bedroom properties, but all we get is 2-bedroom flats. But they don't want to live in them, so they don't bid for them. And it just goes on and on and on. I've seen this for 20 years, and it's getting worse now because the sites are getting bigger. Thank you.
I think the short answer is I largely agree. One of the challenges is the housing associations, while they're very good at what they do, they also want a set of buildings that are easy to manage. And often for them, actually managing a block of flats is a lot easier than managing a pepper-potted range of houses. And I think this is a really interesting point that perhaps we ought to pick up in the local plan map. So we're just redoing the local plan. I'd actually be quite a fan of being a bit stronger in terms of housing mix in the local plan if we can be, and actually prescript a bit more what we want. And when we talk about 2 beds, let's talk about 2-bed houses more than we talk about 2-bedroom flats. I think that's the way to solve it. We can't solve what's been built, as it were, and that's there, but I think we can be stronger through the local plan review.
Can we come back briefly, Chair? Yeah, so the other point is with the garden, if we can put more pressure on them to provide gardens, because one thing that came out with COVID, that when you had young families trapped in these flats and they weren't even allowed to go out, and when they had no option of going into their garden because they didn't have one. I mean, that's, and again, it is possible to provide, even if it's just a small communal space, and, somewhere that a space of their own where you can put up, with one of the rotary drop washers or those sort of things like that. Because I had a friend of mine some years ago was offered they wanted to get her to move up for a 3-bedroomed house. She was taken up, and she looked at a 2-bedroom flat. The rent was more expensive because she was in a former council property, so that didn't help. But then when she looked at it, she said, well, the first thing I've got to do is I've got to buy a tumble dryer because there's nowhere to dry my washing. And when she looked at it, the cost of moving into this property was so high, and the running costs were so much higher that it just wasn't worth her while. So she's still there now, 15 years later. Thank you.
Yes, we can definitely do that. We can make that point to housing associations, and I think we need the carrot and the stick. We need the carrot of talking to them and encouraging, and we need the stick of the local plan review to say you will, assuming we can get it past the inspector, which I hope we can.
It's me. Oh, go on.
Sorry, just one thing to add to that. Are we not then, by trying to encourage people to be in houses rather than flats with no gardens? I mean, my daughter's in exactly the same position. Bought a lovely flat and then realised she had no garden when we were in lockdown. Are we not going to end up then with a huge amount of 2-bedroom flats with no gardens that nobody actually wants? And as we try and move them out, nobody wants to move into them.
No, I think, as Kate says, we're not there yet. I think we need to be stronger through the local plan review to determine what we want. I think there's some really interesting work that's been done in the SHMA, the Strategic Housing Market Assessment, around what type and size of dwellings, houses are required in Basingstoke. I think there's some interesting work there. I think we're not there yet. I think also it would be unfair to say there isn't a need for 2-bed flats. I think what's been raised tonight is some really good points around some of the challenges with them, but equally there is still a need in the market for them. For some people, they do work. Some younger people perhaps who are, potentially, have grown up in Basingstoke but actually are commuting to London, just want somewhere smaller. They don't want the hassle of a garden potentially. There are different issues there, so we need to make sure we don't write them off completely. But I think if we can be stronger in the local plan review to make sure we're building, balance is the key word, definitely.
Well, I think you've all stolen my thunder, because that's what I was actually going on about. Families in flats. We used to have a policy where we tried at one time to actually stop families, unless they really wanted to, especially young families I'm talking about, going in flats. We've just been through COVID, or still going through it, really. And we don't seem to have learnt the lesson that we don't need flats, we need houses for these people, and we should be making a stronger issue. And the ones that are already in flats with young families, we should be trying to move them on, because there's costs involved. I've just moved, and to move is not cheap, to get a removal firm, and some of these people don't earn a lot of money. Some do, some don't, but I'd like to see this council actually have a policy where we try and avoid putting families, especially young families, in flats. We had it before. I don't know what the view of the rest of you councillors, but that's where I'm coming from. And we should learn the lesson of COVID, where people were locked up. In a minute, I'll give you. It's all right. We have this little.
I think we just need to be very careful when we're saying that we put people in flats. There is a choice-based letting scheme, as we know, and people do actively bid, and people make choices, because it is very easy for us to make assumptions about what people may or may want. And obviously, in times of crisis, people also have to make choices. And there are some families for whom flats are actually sought after, if, for example, they don't want a garden, or if people are fleeing issues around domestic abuse, they're perceived as being more secure. So I think that the whole advantage of a choice-based letting system is that the policy is there to set out who may or may not bid, and then people do decide to bid. If we start restricting people's choice or people's ability to exercise that choice, not only will that frustrate people who may actually want to go with the choices in front of them, but it will also potentially lead to quite significant increases in homelessness.
I'd like to come back on that because I obviously don't agree. When you were talking about choice-based lettings, we've got to have a choice. If I was homeless or looking for a house and there was a flat and I had a choice of getting it or not getting it because someone else on the list wanted the house because their needs were greater, what would I do? I'd get a flat. Now, it's a difficult one, but we should be looking, and I think when we're talking about local plans, things like that, they're the instrument that should stop a lot of these flats. We had God knows how many built around the town over the number of years. Are they working? Are they not? Some, as you say, some people do like them, but I think we hide behind choice-based lettings. There isn't enough houses to go around, so you're not really getting a choice. You're getting a choice, but not the choice perhaps people would like. So what I'm saying is if we got a young family in a flat, surely we should be able to move them on quicker or some sort of means if that is possible. That's what we did in the past.
I think it's, as we said tonight, I think the really important thing is we're stronger through the local plan review to make sure that we do have more two-bed houses built. In particular, we know that one-bed houses are a real challenge, but that we have more two-bed houses built, which I think will solve a lot of that. But I think I would agree with Kate that I wouldn't want to restrict people's choice to bid on a property that they feel is appropriate for them. I think the way to solve it is to make sure that we do have more two-bedroom houses in Basingstoke that people can bid on, because then they've got more choice. And I think the answer is more choice, not less choice. Yeah.
Actually, I would agree we want more choice. That's the whole argument. At the end of the day, it's never going to be perfect. We know that. But what we need to make sure we build in things, if we got families that we know are not really settling in flats for whatever reason, especially young families, we should be going at other extra yards trying to get them into a house a lot quicker than what we do. I might be asking the impossible, but if you don't ask, you don't get. Thank you.
No, that's all very fair, and we'll certainly take that on board through the local plan discussions and the housing mix discussions. Importance of two-bedroom houses over and above two-bedroom flats. I think that's clear.
Is there any more questions before we finish them?
Are we going to do comments as well?
Yeah, well, you can do if you want. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't know if we're doing comments separately. So
You have to forgive me. Remember, it's a long time since I chaired a meeting.
yeah. Just a comment really, because I think Tristan was asking in his report about HMOs and the views on HMOs and whether we should be encouraging providers to produce more for us to use. I mean, my thoughts on that were, but also whether we should be using two-bed flats for single people. And I mean, in terms of two-bed flats for single people, if they can't be let and, you know, they're proving difficult to let, I think, yes, it would be a useful tool. But I think what we need to be mindful of is the bedroom tax and the benefit cap, so that, you know, they may well go in there in a position where they can afford it. You know, they may be working in a well-paid job, but then if we have another COVID or something like that, they might quickly find they can't afford that. And, you know, and I would say that if that is the case, there ought to be some safeguards so that if they do get in a situation like that, they can quickly go back on the list and, you know, and make sure, you know, they're not stuck there with the provider sort of chasing them for debts which they're never going to be able to pay. So, you know, if you do go along that line, I would suggest you have that safeguard in place in terms of, you know, a quick ability to get back on the waiting list if the circumstances change at all. So that, and HMOs, yeah, I agree with you, because I think a lot of you know, single people, you know, and especially under 25s, probably would rather share, they would rather, you know, not have the responsibility of all the utility bills that go with a flat, and, you know, in the same way and the same level. But again, I think if we do house them in HMOs, they should have the ability to go back, stay on the list, or go back on the list when they're ready. So that's my thoughts on those two things. If you want what they were. Okay, thanks.
That's really helpful. Actually, I think the key with HMOs is to make sure they're well run, and that's why we're engaging with the housing associations. I'm very keen that actually, if Sovereign and Vivid could act as as the landlord of a HMO, so that we know that's well run, so it's run by a housing association. Actually, that could start to solve some of the single persons issues. And yes, they could absolutely remain on the list while they were doing that. And I agree with you on the 2-bedroom flats for single people. I think it makes sense to do that, but we need to make sure the safeguards are in place for things like the spare room subsidy and the benefit cap. Yeah.
Review of the works programme. I believe we've got something from Carolyn, which you put in. Yeah, and that's to do with the grass cutting, was it not? Yeah. From my position, I personally would like to see this because, yes, there is reasons why it hasn't been good this year, but we need to know why and what we can do about them. I'm looking at the committee. Are we happy to have that on our works programme for next time? Yeah. Good.
Chair, I checked on timings and I think it's probably likely that it will come in January as a report, if that's okay.
Well, we haven't got a choice if the officers can't get it in time, but we do need. We have no more on the works programme. I think we should be looking at a lot more stuff than what we are at the moment. So if we can get something forward, send it to Sadie and we can get something forward for the next meeting, because I do not want to cancel scrutiny, because I think over the years we haven't done us justice where we're actually stopping meetings, because I thought tonight was a good meeting. You may say different, but things were coming out, was asking the questions. This is what it's all about, and we need to start asking questions. We're not here to hammer the cabinet or anybody else. We're here to find out what's going wrong, what's working, what isn't, can it be changed. So can you all put your thinking caps on and think of different things you'd perhaps go forward with? Sorry.
Chair, can we also agree what's happening with the performance panel, please?
We brought up last time, we didn't actually select a performance panel. Do we want one, or do we want to just keep it up, bring it back to this committee as a whole and look at it? I'm looking towards, I haven't sat on this committee for a long time, so I'm looking at people who have and might have more thoughts.
Yeah, I've always had a view on this. I was on the performance panel for about 4 or 5 years, and Ian was there as well. I often felt there were some very, very important issues that really got a bit subsumed underneath that really should have been done at this committee. And so I'd be more than happy to suggest that what the performance panel would do, so it comes here. I mean, it is quite a chunky report to look at, but it's extremely important.
Yeah, I would agree with Graham. I think the reason it came about many years ago is because we used to have the government at that time had a massive list of KPIs that it was like this thick we had to go through, and that's gradually been whittled down over the years. And so the amount we get isn't overwhelming, but it is very useful, and you generally just got a report back from whoever's the chair at the time. And I've been on it for probably longer than Graham, and I've thought, what is the point of this? Because we either go through it again, but not in the same detail, because you don't have the report in front of you. It'd be much more useful if it came to, because again, as you say, we've often been in a situation where they've been cancelling meetings. They only have them about 4 times a year, I think, don't they? So and it's just another meeting to hold in the day anyway. So it was always a bit of an old one. But yeah, I'd agree with Graham. It's something we should bring to scrutiny. If we had to have more scrutiny meetings, I think that's a problem anyway. But we'll fit it in. But at least everyone would have a better idea of what's going on with these things. Because it covers all the performance indicators for things like waste collection, housing, and those sorts of things, which we sort of cover, and we do duplicate a lot of work, and and for those of us who are on it, we just have to listen to it again. So just do it once and properly. Thank you.
Well, as chair, I would agree. I'd like to see it come in. I'm looking around, I've got some nods, so we would. You have to leave mine on. This concludes the meeting. Thank you very much.